first thing to be said is that I've been connected with Amigos for a while, but have had an interest in the coast for far longer than that. My connection actually with Bolsa Chica really came into focus when I was on the Coastal Commission, and that was back at a time when coastal commissioners were permitted to do some serious negotiation with the various players. Now, of course, the so-called ex parte rules really limit the way in which coastal commissioners can function in terms of dealing with specific projects, because after all, the commission is supposed to be functioning as a quasi-judicial body. But my initial acquaintance with Bolsa Chica really was as a coastal commissioner. And well, let's see. I suppose we ought to point out that the story of the California coast is really a very, very long one. Originally, I started out in that fine coastal community of Bakersfield. I say that merely because as a child, my father and I would go out into the foothills sometimes, and one of the things that we found were some very ancient, I think about 15 million year old shark's teeth. So I want you to know that the notion of sea level rise is not exactly something that has occurred to some of us in recent time. The coast has always been a dynamic force and has a long, long history, and hopefully will have helpful and useful history going forward, regardless of what we manage to do in our fairly short history before the coast. Well, I at some point found myself escaping Bakersfield and got a little closer to the coast, and so most of my career has been involved with the Long Beach community. And if any of you care to know how I wound up as a coastal commissioner, the answer sort of is that, as they say in the real estate arena, frequently it's location, location, location that matters. And although I was on a city environmental advisory committee, I really didn't have a whole lot of political activity going when an opportunity arose. And the opportunity really arose because number one, I'd been involved with the city as well as with the Sierra Club. And one of the little tales that I'm told occurred was that my name sort of trickled up to Sacramento at some point in time after Proposition 20 was winding down, and there was a brand new Coastal Act that was going to be in place, and we'll get to that in a moment or two. But the fact of the matter is that apparently some folks up there found out that I was favored for a slot on the Coastal Commission by both the Sierra Club and the city of Long Beach, which made no sense to anybody who knew very much about either one of those organizations. So somebody said, never heard of him, let's get him appointed. And the location, location, location thing was that I was in the office on the 5th floor of the Security Bank building here in Long Beach as a fairly brand new attorney. And on the 6th floor was the district office of then Senator Kinnock, who was one of the 5 members of the Senate Rules Committee. And what we discovered was that the men's room was between the 5th and 6th floor, and we were essentially, apparently, on the same coffee cycle. So we got to chat for a bit, and he knew who I was, and one thing led to another, and so it went. I was originally an appointee to the then Regional Commission by the Senate Rules Committee, but even before that occurred, we probably ought to back up and talk a little bit about how even that occurred. And back in the late 60s, a number of things had happened that kind of raised the environmental awareness of folks in California. In, I think it was 1969, we had that horrendous oil platform disaster off the Santa Barbara coast that got a number of people really very interested in trying to figure out how in the world we could save or protect the coast. And a number of citizens got together and thought that there really needed to be some kind of comprehensive approach to what happened along the coast. And one theme, it seems to me, that has run through this process constantly is that we're dealing not only with the science of coastal circumstances, but we're also very much dealing with the politics that goes along with the planning process. And so a number of folks decided that they would go to Sacramento, and perhaps there could be some kind of legislation that would help to protect the coast. And so some of my original heroes, Alan Cerroti comes to mind, for instance, was one of the individuals who carried legislation over the course of about 3 years as a member of the California Assembly. And each time the legislation passed through the Assembly and then died in a Senate committee. And so eventually in 1972, folks both in Sacramento as well as across the state kind of scratched their head and concluded that the only way we could have serious coastal protection and coastal planning was to use the initiative process, which was a very different kind of thing to do back in the 70s than it is now. And so a number of folks got together and put together a proposal to create a temporary coastal commission that would sunset after about 3 or 4 years, but in the interim would come up with a plan for the California coast that would be then submitted to the legislature, presumably for it to then put together legislation that would in fact be protective of the California coast. This was back in 1972, I guess it was. And one of the remarkable things is that the proposal was approved for circulation by those who were promoting the initiative. And in the course of about 30 days, I think it was about 416,000 signatures were obtained. This was before we had email, before we had an internet, before we had all of those social media things that we count upon to get the processes of politics going now. And part of the magic was, again, timing, because there was I believe it was a convention of the League of Women Voters had a state convention, and several somebodies obviously thought that getting a lot of petitions to them and then having them work their magic around the state might be very helpful. And so we can talk a little bit about the structure of that legislation, but the good news was, after a really significant political fight, the proposition in 1972 was passed by the voters by about a 10% margin of victory. In Long Beach, I would add, it lost by about 10%, but Long Beach has, over the course of its history, had to be educated by some of the rest of us as to what was best for Long Beach. So that's a process, unfortunately, that still is continuing. Well, let's see. The original commission was a strange creature, which still has a lot of its structure existing to this day, as it turns out. The state was divided up into 6 regions, and our region was all of LA and Orange counties coastal area. And what happened was that the legislation contemplated that there would be a regional commission for each one of those individual areas, and then there would be a state commission that would consist of folks that were representatives of the regional commissions, plus people appointed directly to the state commission, just to make it really interesting, or beyond the control of any one political power. We had the governor appointing 1/3 of the members of both the regional of the state commission, the Senate rules appointing 1/3, and the Speaker of the Assembly appointing 1/3. And then the regional commissions were set up so that local governments had to nominate and then appoint representatives to the regional commissions. And the idea essentially was that the regional commissions would work very hard to come up with plans, proposed plans for their areas, and the state commission ultimately would approve those plans, and then it would all be shipped off to Sacramento. And the rather remarkable thing was that the system kind of worked the way it was supposed to. The plan was put together, such as it was, in time and under budget, and presented to the legislature for its review and presumed adoption. Well, that isn't quite the way it worked out, of course, because it was clear that there was a lot more to be done, and the ultimate result, after a lot of shoving and pushing, was that the legislature concluded that it was legislatively going to create a permanent coastal commission to do a whole variety of things that we can ultimately talk about. I'm reminded as I'm talking, and I didn't didn't put together all the things that I might touch upon, but one of the things that occurs to me as I'm talking that occurred having something to do with Bolsa Chica was that as a regional coastal commissioner, I was involved in the process of helping to create what turned out to be the approval of some at least proposed so-called local coastal programs, which we can talk about. And one of the tales I recall as we were shoving and pushing was that at one point, at the only point that then Governor George Deukmejian never met with anybody representing the Coastal Commission, happened when the Bolsa Chica was one of the things that we were all concerned about. And that meeting took place on one of his birthdays. So Michael Fisher, who was then the executive director of the State Coastal Commission, and I then as the chair of the State Commission met in Sacramento with George Deukmejian, and I think we were served up just a little before the cake and ice cream. The fun part of it was that we had an office up in Eureka working with local government as best it could to prepare plans locally. And the governor had decided that he clearly didn't like the commission. In fact, he would have gotten rid of it if he had the votes, as he said. And so he decided that the Eureka office ought to be eliminated. And his excuse, as he gave it to Mike Fisher and me in that meeting, was that since all of the local plans had already been approved by the Coastal Commission, there was no need to have a coastal staff presence up in the Eureka area. And we had to explain to him that, in fact, none of the plans had even been considered by the Coastal Commission for approval, and that so his response was, after conferring with some of his staff, well, there was a good reason for that. The Coastal Commission was so hostile to local government desires that they had never bothered to present the Coastal Commission with any of the plans that might otherwise have been subject to Coastal Commission review. And then we had a representative of George Deukmejian, a non-voting member, who was kind of entertaining from time to time because he was so ineffective, thank goodness. But one of his the favorite things he had to say in connection with Bolsa Chica was, he said, well, you know, species come, species go. It's just a natural process. And so there's no need really for us to worry about protecting that part of the coast. And also, as I'm sort of telling coastal tales, one of my other favorite experiences when I was on the regional commission, we met once a week and alternated between the city council chambers in Torrance and the city council chamber that many of you are familiar with in Huntington Beach. And at the time, one of our regional coastal commissioners was a city councilman from the city of Los Angeles by the name of Art Snyder. who was kind of a character, to put it politely. In fact, he was so much of a character that the rumor had it that there was a Mexican mafia contract out on him, and he had two plainclothes police bodyguards with him at all times. And I can still remember sitting in the chambers, and I have no idea what I was arguing about, but I made the political mistake of mentioning Art Snyder's name in my comments, and Art took that as license to respond immediately, because of course his was a quite different opinion. And I wasn't going to back down, and he wasn't going to back down, and we just both kept yapping away until we both ran out of breath about the same time, and I was really shaking. So I decided I better get up and go to that room behind the city council chambers for a cup of coffee. And to get there, I had to walk by those two bodyguards, and they were kind of laughing. And one of them looked at me and said, "You know, we're not going to be anybody's second, but if you need them, we've got some dueling pistols in the car." So sometimes tempers and emotions have been very much in evidence, and I guess, although I haven't heard anybody doing gun stories lately about Coastal Commission hearings, we certainly have a lot of emotions still to go. Well, let's see. If you've got any questions as I'm sort of talking along, do let me know. The Coastal Act of the original Coastal Act, which of course was Proposition 20, brought us to the Coastal Act of 1976, and that created a whole circumstance for some serious planning, which fortunately or unfortunately is going on to this day. The idea was that all of the local jurisdictions in the coastal area ought to come up with plans, so-called local coastal programs, consisting both of land use plans indicating the density and the nature of the use of land in the coastal area, as well as so-called implementing ordinances, frequently zoning ordinances that would in fact implement those plans. And some communities did a fairly decent job of moving forward with the planning process, and some had their difficulties. The idea, as most of you know, is that there are a whole variety of policies that are supposed to be woven into those local plans, whether the policies have to do with protecting and promoting public access or protecting coastal resources, especially wetlands, and a variety of other policies that you are all probably somewhat familiar with, since you're all engaged in one fashion or another in matters of coastal protection. And all of those policies appear in the Coastal Act itself in an area that's referred to as Chapter 3. The policies have changed a little bit from time to time with legislative changes, but you know, to recite a number of them, there's the inclusion of lower cost visitor accommodations. We've got to be concerned about protecting habitat, marine habitat. We've got visual resources that are important. We do concern ourselves with geologic stability and what falls and doesn't fall into the ocean. Protecting agricultural lands has been an important element over the course of time, and even dealing with onshore and offshore oil and gas development are all things that have policy directions that appear in the Coastal Act itself. And so the planning process for those local coastal programs, weaving those kind of policies in a way that allows local government to administer those policies, hopefully, has been one of the struggles that we've all had to deal with from time to time. Basically, the idea was that when a local government had prepared a local coastal program, it would be submitted to the Coastal Commission for certification or approval, and almost inevitably the Coastal Commission would conclude that the plan had some problems or defects, and although the process has changed over time thanks to some litigation, basically the Coastal Commission cannot force local government to adopt a specific set of rules or regulations or plans, but they can deny the plans and suggest modifications that could make the plans consistent. And that's true of both the original submittals as well as any amendments that may be considered down the road. And of course, we've had to deal with lots of amendments over the course of time. One of the other problems, of course, is that over the course of almost half a century, our understanding of coastal resources and planning issues and our concerns and what's happened to the coast, it's all been subject to some significant changes. And so once you've got a local coastal program in place, there's no real mechanism to require local government to update their plans to meet those new considerations, even though there's a very weak scheme of things that contemplates a periodic review of those plans, but it really has no meaningful teeth. So we're dealing frequently with plans that appear to be a bit out of date, and we do the best we can under those crazy circumstances. I suppose I should also mention that in places like Huntington Beach or Long Beach, the area of the coastal zone just goes in a fairly short area, and you have to get out the maps to see just exactly where the coastal zone is. In other areas like the Santa Monica Mountains, rural areas, the regulatory zone may go up to 5 miles inland. And so you really have to look at the maps to figure out where things stand. I had intended to throw up a couple or so pictures, which I guess I can do as I'm chatting here, showing some of the coastal stuff. Let's see what happens. There we go. One of the places we've had to deal with regularly, and when I say we, I suppose I ought to admit that after, Shirley I'm sure feels the same way, after you've been at this for a while, you sort of feel like you have a proprietary interest in the coast. And so I find myself saying we, even though I haven't been on the Coastal Commission since, 1986. So it's been a while. But one of the one of the issues we had to deal with, and the commission has to deal with, is what happens right along the various coasts. You've got Malibu, for instance, where you've got houses side by side blocking the view corridor, such as it isn't. And also there appears to be an ocean out there that may not get its arrive at Bakersfield anytime soon, but is certainly going to be an issue for some of those folks going forward. There's Broad Beach, where some of the big fights we've had from time to time and still find things to battle about have given us a lot to chew on. You've got the various landforms and water forms that we've been concerned about over time. Sea Ranch up in Northern California is one of the original areas that inspired the original Prop 20 Act itself, because about 10 miles of coastline was essentially cut off from any public access at all. And the Coastal Commission came in and took a look at what the development proposals were, and of course had permitting authority. And the result over the course of several years was the development of some public access trails and ways that allowed the Sea Ranch development to proceed in a way that allowed both public as well as a number of second home folks to be able to enjoy that part of the coast. On the other hand, we've got all of that stuff in Southern California to deal with, whether it's battles we've had involving the Pacific Palisades area, some of it cliffs falling down, and major development battles over the course of time that have resulted in everything from some coastal commissioners being removed in the middle of coastal commission hearings because somebody didn't like what they appeared to be up to. And so goes the battle. And then we've got Venice, where it's been an area that has long had a history of going more and more into an area where people just can't afford to live or reside or access unless they've got lots of money. San Pedro, part of Los Angeles, that again has been the subject of lots of coastal battles. Long Beach, of course, is where I come from, and one of the things in terms of our Long Beach experience was that just as the Coastal Act of 1976 was coming into place, we'd had a wonderful political scandal. The planning director of the city of Long Beach, who attended every one of the meetings that I presided at as the chair of the city's Environmental Advisory Committee, turned out to be a rather corrupt individual who had managed to get himself arrested shortly after I left that body. He was picked up in a local parking lot next to a high-end restaurant with a shoebox full of Mexican coins that was the payoff for some of the stuff that he had been doing in parts of Long Beach's coastal zone. And the beauty of that was that he no longer was employed by the city, and we lost the city manager essentially at the same time, although he wasn't charged with corruption. Nevertheless, he had some serious political problems, and so we had a brand new planning director and a brand new city manager as I became a brand new coastal commissioner. And the beauty was that the kind of closed and corrupt process that had been going on for far too long meant that they had to get some fresh air into City Hall for a while. And the way they went about doing it was creating a planning body made up of representatives of the community, consisting of folks from the real estate business, the Sierra Club, various homeowners associations, and a whole variety of folks. And for about 3 years, that body put together a comprehensive plan for much of the Long Beach coastline, and with few minor exceptions, the Planning Commission and the City Council approved that plan, and it was submitted to the Coastal Commission, which essentially certified or approved that local coastal plan while I was still on the Coastal Commission. And I had the privilege of handing the keys to the city back to the then mayor so that they could go forward with far more control than otherwise had been the case. Of course, as it turns out, that didn't stop a lot of the controversies that we've had to still deal with, but it turned out to be a really interesting exercise. The downtown Long Beach waterfront looks very different than it did when I first came to town. One of the problems with Long Beach's plan was that when I first arrived, a number of someones had decided that they ought to fill in a good part of the Pacific Ocean out near where once the Rainbow Lagoon and Rainbow Pier had been located, thought that perhaps there'd be some public park availability. And the unfortunate situation was that the fill had essentially cut off downtown from the waterfront. So part of the planning effort was trying to figure out how to reconnect the downtown Long Beach waterfront with its own downtown. And it's hardly a perfect solution or resolution, but it goes to show you, I think, that planning is kind of important wherever you are, even if it's at Bolsa Chica. And of course, this is a few years old, but indeed, there's an inlet there. Still is, and hopefully, if things work well, we're able to maintain that. Let me get back to chatting a little bit about Bolsa Chica. Why not? That's part of what we're talking about, I guess. As we all know, of course, the Bolsa Chica wetlands is largely a county island, and still, of course, doesn't have a LCP in place that means of course, that Coastal Commission will continue to have a major role, and given the fact that the Coastal Commission has continuing responsibilities when it comes to wetland issues, that will hopefully continue to be something that we're all keeping an eye on. As most of you know, that once upon a time, actually back during my Coastal Commission career, there were plans for building about 5,700 homes in what is the wetland area. We were talking about creating a commercial complex, a 1,700 boat marina, and the navigable channel that was to help support all of this. And while I was on the commission, near the end of my commission career, the commission on a number of occasions considered a major set of plans that I jokingly referred to as a plan that never could be implemented, even though the Coastal Commission had decided that it was going to approve a good portion of that plan with a variety of conditions that had to be met before anything could go forward. And it was clear to me that those conditions could never, ever be met. And so I like to refer to what the county had presented to the Coastal Commission, and then the commission had acted on, as the commission in effect denying the plan with the conditions it submitted. And of course, ultimately we had the 1989 coalition plan that some of you are familiar with, that deleted the marina and got us much closer to where we currently are. And then what was it, 1997, I guess it was, that the State Lands Commission purchased 880 acres of the lowland using funds largely contributed by the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles. And of course, the planning and the restoration efforts and what happens there continue on. I've been, as we've been chatting, a lot less organized than I anticipated being. And I don't know how helpful I've been in terms of just sort of wandering around, thinking out loud about some of my Coastal Commission experiences. If you want a far more formal version with some clearer structure, I can get to you a link to the lecture that I gave at the Long Beach Marina about 4 or 5 years ago, where I covered a bunch of this stuff in a much more organized fashion with a bit more structure in terms of how the commission works and functions. I'm not sure how long I'm supposed to go on, but if there are any concerns or questions or things that you'd like me to address, I'd be happy to do so. So.
Thank you, Mel.
I think I've eaten up about an hour.
Yeah, and if anyone has questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
I've got a couple, but let me get started with one, and then for Mel as an attorney. Back when I got started with Bolsa Chica, there was an interesting feature of state law called the Coastal Act Guidelines, which has disappeared from our consideration, but it specifically mentioned Bolsa Chica and allowed a marina to be built under certain conditions. So it was very important to the Amigos de Bolsa Chica in the early days. My understanding is that those guidelines were, well, possibly illegal, and that they were thrown out by a court decision in a lawsuit brought by the Bolsa Chica Land Trust many years later. What can you tell us about those guidelines and whether those were created by the legislature or by the commission or some other body, and what real legal impact they might have had?
Well, what we have, what those guidelines had a number of folks focusing on was the question of what their significance really would be. They weren't, the Coastal Commission, as I recall, in fact, considered and adopted a whole variety of guidelines with the notion that they would be helpful to local government in dealing with the planning process, as well as those who had thoughts about what kind of developments they might want to pursue. Part of the problem was that they were, no one was quite sure what kind of an animal this was, because they weren't adopted as regulations and therefore didn't appear to be actually binding on anyone. And at the same time, there was concern that they would sort of be used by the Coastal Commission in its decision-making process as, in some fashion, semi-binding, if you will, or more than mere suggestions or guidance. And so what you suggested, Vic, I think is what ultimately happened. What they just sort of disappeared. On the other hand, if I recall correctly, there were some specific amendments to the Coastal Act having to do with Bolsa Chica specifically, contemplating that under certain circumstances, a boating facility could be constructed in, at least in part, in the lowlands. And the specifics have kind of escaped me, but it ultimately became clear that although legislatively there was this path that might have been followed, as a practical matter, it just didn't ultimately make any sense. And so turned out not ultimately to be meaningful. But that was a little different, I think, than the situation with the guidelines. But and I'm not sure how those two things interface, but you're absolutely right. Those guidelines sort of are of I guess they're of historical significance only at this point.
And probably good riddance. Thanks, Mel.
Yeah.
And I think, and you have reminded me, there were some passages right in the Coastal Act itself about Bolsa Chica, and of course those would be binding as acts of the legislature.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Guidelines.
Yeah, true. Yes.
Mel, didn't the Army, I think it was probably left up to the Army Corps of Engineers with that last approval with conditions that the Coastal Commission made, that they had to prove that the title or the entrance to the boating facility could be done in a way that would not be diminish the environment. They had to prove a lot of things up, which I think most of us felt would be impossible. It just couldn't happen. It was
it dealt with everything from sand transport issues to I don't remember all the specifics now, but it was absolutely clear to me that the conditions that were proposed never could come into play. And I might add that this was a planning document or a planning scheme rather than a coastal development permit scheme. Originally, the Coastal Commission attempted to when to approve various plans subject to conditions that it would impose, and litigation resulted in a determination that the Coastal Commission under the Coastal Act had no power to condition the approval of any local coastal plans. And so our attorneys and planners decided to do a creative end run around that, which was to say if a plan wasn't adequate to meet the requirements of the Coastal Act policies, that the commission could simply deny the plan and then could make suggested modifications. And if local government were willing to accept those suggested modifications, then they didn't have to go through another convoluted hearing process. They simply had to have local government adopt those suggested modifications as part of their plan and then submit the revised plan back to commission staff, and then there'd be essentially a Coastal Commission sign-off of the revised plan. And that way, we didn't condition it, but if you wanted to have your plan approved, you might embrace those suggested modifications, or if you preferred, you could resubmit a plan with changes that dealt with the concerns and issues that the commission had raised in its findings denying the plan.
And that was at the time the coalition was formed, when Hearthside Homes saw that they were not making much progress with the commission. That's when they formed the local coalition that came together with the plan you eventually, with some changes, but eventually that was the plan that the commission could accept at that point.
Right. Yep.
And the coalition was a local government, actually the county government, and the owners of the property. And they were just tired of fighting, and it was costing them an enormous amount of money. And we were also settling the legal suit that we had had for years and years, the Amigos and Hearthside Homes. That was being settled at that time. So a lot of things were coming together. And also we were getting political clout at that point. And
well, you know, there's been more than one bit of litigation involving Bolsa, Chica, and certainly the Amigos have been were involved in litigation before even I arrived on the scene. But the final scheme that I referred to had to do with a big fight about whether or not the Amigos were entitled to be involved in a significant fashion in terms of the planning process, and the Hearthside Homes, or whatever hat they were wearing at the time, had concluded that an earlier settlement of litigation that had involved a confidential settlement agreement was being breached by the Amigos, and we were unfortunately being criticized by some of our fellow so-called environmentalists for having sold out to the developer. And it was extremely frustrating because we knew what was in that confidential agreement, but we couldn't say anything about it. And then, thank goodness for incompetence, the attorneys that decided to challenge us legally filed a complaint with the Orange County Superior Court seeking to require that we become involved in arbitration, because there was an arbitration provision within the agreement. And rather than having the confidential agreement under seal, they attached the whole confidential agreement to their complaint, which, number one, of course, breached their obligation to keep it confidential, but number two, made it a whole lot easier for us to point out how we weren't doing anything that we were to be criticized for by the land trust and other folks that had looked askance upon what they thought we were up to. So that was, you know, we fought the battle about whether or not we'd have a court hearing or arbitration, and ultimately the decision was made that we would have to arbitrate, and that went on for what, about 3 years. And then a month before the week-long arbitration hearing was to begin, Hearthside raised the white flag and gave us everything that we figured we were entitled to. And part of the craziness, I reached no confidence at this point. Part of the craziness was our defense was being financed by an insurance company that didn't know how to read its own policy. And I was getting paid, as was their in-house counsel, to defend all of this. And there was a provision in the insurance policy that indicated that it didn't cover anything arising out of previous litigation. And when they finally awoke to the fact that they shouldn't have been paying us for the last 3 years, we had just about finished the game. And so I said, well, if you try to pull the plug now with a settlement just about to be achieved, you're going to be in deep, deep trouble. And so that was the end of that. But I think Amigos occasionally has been kind of fortunate.
Well, we lost some friends along the way, but we held our ground because we knew what we were doing was right. And we also knew what we were doing would lead or achieve the results we wanted. And so it was sometimes a terrible time for us to take some of the insults we were getting. But we knew at the end of the day, we were going to achieve what we wanted. And that's the path we went down. And certainly with your help as our attorney, before we had to rely on the daughters of our founding members and people, you know, that maybe did not have the kind of experience you did. And I can remember one night when I was a coastal commissioner, I was in San Diego and I got an emergency call from you. I happened to miss dinner that night, my friend. But you had a call to me with this latest information. So you always kept in touch with us, and you're part of the reason we were successful.
Well, let's hope going forward we continue to be successful.
After 50 years, it gets a little tiring, but I guess it's become such a part of our life that we know it better than we know some personal things about ourselves. So we'll keeps the blood flowing, and it was a cause that was worthwhile. And we can always look back. Every time I pass the Bolsa Chica, I say, thank God I had a part in that. And I think it was quite an accomplishment, but well worth it.
Yep.